So welcome everyone. This is the ST3 Orthopaedic interview podcast, and this is our first episode. I'm very excited that we're joined by Mr Adam Pilarski, who's currently an ST3 Trauma Orthopaedic Registrar working in the West Midlands. So hi Adam, how are you doing?
Hi mate, how you doing? You all right?
Yeah, good, thank you. So as I said on my previous podcast, the aim of this interview series is to give people coming up to the ST3 Orthopaedic interview an insight into the whole interview process, and also the stations and what to expect. So today we're going to be focusing on the structure of the orthopaedic interview. So if I could just kick off, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your path into ST3 at the moment.
Yeah, sure, delighted to. So my path into ST3 is a little bit unusual, as I'm sure lots of people you end up interviewing will probably end up saying. So I applied at the end of my core surgical training in the West Midlands, and applied at the end of CT2 in 2019. And got an offer for a number in the West Midlands, but also had an opportunity to go off and do a master's degree, to do an MBA at the same time. So I decided to do that instead, and then reapply later to ST3 following that. But then obviously got the COVID changes meant that interviews were cancelled, so I ended up from having a number to being unappointable in a year's difference. So then reapplied again the following year and got a number. So
awesome.
So I was in, out, and in again. So.
Exactly, but I guess from that you've got the unique perspective in that you have gone for a face-to-face interview for an ST3 and been successful, and also gone through the virtual format and been successful as well. So given that at the time of filming this we don't actually know what the orthopaedic ST3 interview is going to look like, whether it's going to be virtual, hybrid, or even face-to-face, I guess you can kind of cover all bases in that sense.
Yeah, happy to give some insights about both experiences really, and then and kind of my take on both, I guess.
So I guess to start off with, I want to ask you, when did you start to think about the ST3 interview in your CT2 or equivalent year? Was it early on? Was it before that?
Yeah, it was probably, I mean, I quite like to prepare for things, so I probably don't like to leave it to the last minute. So I sort of started thinking probably, it was probably sort of December, November time. I started thinking about doing some sort of more intense revision really starting off slowly and then gradually building up to do more intense revision for the interview process itself. Although clearly the first hurdle is to actually get an interview as you begin, but then once you're in, then.
And what did that preparation look like? Is it what you were told by people, or did you just kind of make up your own sort of formula?
Yes, I think, well, I mean, a lot of us will know other people maybe that have applied and gone through the process and got a sense of what's going on. For me, I was doing an orthopaedic CT2 job for the whole year. So I had some people that I could pick the brains of, other trainees in the West Midlands that I could ask as we went. And, it really consisted, I think early doors, it was very lightweight. I mean, I wasn't doing, 5 hours a night for the 6 months leading up to the interview or something like that. So just a bit of reading really. So, it's very important to focus on the things that they're going to ask you about. You need to be able to quote the BOSE guidelines for various, conditions, and be up to date with some of the slightly more niche ones as well, like, peripheral nerve injuries and those kind of things. And then just about, a lot of the revision really is about gearing yourself up to be a good ST3, right? That's what the whole point of the interview really is to test you're going to be a good, safe day one registrar. So to be honest, if you plan to do orthopedics, then doing your revision really should just be keeping up with your day-to-day knowledge about how to manage various conditions that you manage on an on-call day-to-day.
Yeah, and I guess when you find out you have an interview, you've got a kind of a dual responsibility. One is you want to be responsible for preparing for the interview, but at the same time, you're trying to maximize the points you have in the portfolio. So did you give your time solely to try and get more audits and presentations and publications to maximize that, or revise for the interview itself? Or
yeah, it's a good question. It's actually it became incredibly important last year when they didn't interview and all they judged you on was the shortlisting score. So then all your points and points being prizes and all your audits and presentations and stuff were basically all that counted. It's difficult. A lot of the stuff on the shortlisting score is stuff that doesn't really come. It's not stuff you can turn around overnight. An audit you can spin around quite quickly, to be honest. But publications, presentations, PGCE, all these kind of things are a bit difficult to develop. But having said that, all of the stuff, it's not necessarily different stuff than what you've been tested on in your CT applications in the first place. So, it's just building upon that really. It's probably worth, if you're watching this and you're a CT1, or even an F2 and thinking about applying to orthopedics in the future, then clearly it's good to try and build upon these things early doors, because it's actually quite, well, I mean, publications obviously take ages, but even getting a presentation is actually quite, I found quite tricky. So So I focused mainly on the interview, really, to be honest, mate. I didn't at that point, I wasn't really focusing on getting extra points for the shortlisting score, because I kind of knew what I was going to get based on the templates from the previous year. So
yeah, and I think a lot of things that caught people out was that actually only national, international oral presentations gave you any points on that self-scoring, rather than poster presentations or local or regional oral presentations. So a lot of the good stuff that people did locally couldn't count for anything, unfortunately. So yeah, it's actually surprisingly difficult, isn't it, to get oral national or international presentations?
Yeah, I've got some of my friends are were very good at getting this sort of stuff, but I just never managed to tip that. So I had some publications from med school, and I luckily managed to get some more during my time from foundation onwards. But yeah, presentation was always a bit difficult.
Sure. So even those publications you have from medical school still gave you points and counted?
So I had, so in fairness, they were projects that started in med school and got published in foundation years. I think there was one project that I published in med school that has PubMed IDable. So as long as it's got a PubMed ID, it's really all that matters, isn't it? So.
I mean, if you were anything like me, I had, I think, a case report in med school, which was probably my highlight, and I was very distraught to find out that counts for absolutely nothing for the ST3 Trauma Orthopaedic interview. So yeah, anyone listening out there, case reports unfortunately don't count either. So perhaps targeting a bigger project that will give you some output rather than several case reports as well.
A tip that I definitely put forward is something that I think has only really come out in the last couple of years, are these kind of multi-center trainee-led audits that you can do. So a couple of my colleagues started them during our core training years, but now you had COVID surge and surge week and all these kind of things where you can get a lot of publications out. Clearly not first author ones, but ones where you're at least on the author list for not a great deal of work.
So, I mean, turning to the interview itself, can you just talk me through a timeline of, in your, ST3, CT2 equivalent year, when did you apply for the on Oriel or the application system? When did you get an interview and so on, and ranking, and etc.? Yeah,
so I was just reminding myself earlier about the dates, because obviously it changed over the last couple of years and was very different for last year, for 2020's things. But 2021, so this current year, so the year just gone, they opened the applications earlier than usual. So they opened them in November, end of November. They'd normally open them in about January time. So I think that may have caught some people out, again, the fact that it was opened earlier than anticipated. So just keep a close eye on when the dates are announced on Oriel. So opened in November, closed in December for applications. And then they did the self-assessment verification online, which again is new in the new world of COVID that we live in. And then interviews were in late March, with offers. They were scheduled to be in May, but they were actually given out at the end of April. This year just gone. So.
And when do you actually start ranking your preferences? Is that after you've done the interview or before?
Yeah, so after interview, they did preference ranking. Yeah.
Fine. So after the interview, but before you actually find out your ranking and which of your preferences you're going to be given.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's different in some specialties. So some specialties you'll know where you rank before you start or what ranking you are before you start to rank your preferences. Although, I mean, there's pros and cons to both ways, I suppose. But ultimately, you probably shouldn't let your ranking dictate where you want to go, because you never know how popular the place you want to go to actually is going to be. Maybe the people don't want to go to, say, London or Oxford this year because, they've got other reasons that they want to go elsewhere. So.
Sure. Yeah. And talking about the interview itself, how many stations did you have in both the face-to-face and the virtual format?
Yeah, so the normal, I say normal, we don't know, right? But the usual method for the ST3 interview was to have a 5-station OSCE type setup. So you'd have, you'd rotate around 5 different stations, and you'd do each of those for about 15 minutes. But then in the new format that was cut down to 3. So they took out the communication station and the technical skills station. So you just essentially were left with clinical, portfolio, and list prioritization. Also, you did a presentation in the list prioritization station previously, but they didn't do that, or at least didn't happen in my year, but it may happen in years ongoing. I don't know. So that was a 3-minute oral presentation that you had to prepare beforehand.
Fine. So in your the stations that you had in your face-to-face format, how many examiners did you have sitting across the table from you?
So it was usually a panel of thinking back, it was usually a panel of 3. So which was, again, similar makeup to the online version, with or without. So 3 people or 2 people assessing you, plus one other person who may be a lay person or maybe an external examiner. But on the online version, it was 1 for each station, essentially. So.
Fine. And was that the same in the virtual format that you've just done this year gone?
Yeah, so sorry, so virtual was 3, so one examiner for each station, separate examiner for each station, and then another person on the call who was the sort of an admin person, just keeping an eye really. And I think some people would have had an extra person on who was a lay observer, just to make sure that it seemed like a fair process.
Yeah.
But in the face-to-face, yeah, it was usually panels of 3. So.
And what did you find more difficult? Did you find the face-to-face stations more difficult, or the virtual format, just comparing portfolio and so on?
Yeah, I found virtual much more difficult actually. Yeah, much more difficult. It's very hard to kind of gauge because you've got the stations are slightly shorter anyway, which makes things a little bit more pressured, I think, in terms of time. But also, it's very difficult to gauge reaction on Zoom. I find, like if you, I mean, obviously, maybe the idea is that the examiners probably shouldn't give you an idea whether you're doing well or not. If you know what I mean, it should be quite objective. But equally, when you're face to face, at least you get a sense of how well you're doing and how well things are moving on, etc. But on Zoom, it's much more tricky, I found. So.
Fine. So obviously you've cut down from 5 stations to 3 stations, going from the face-to-face to the virtual format. Does that mean that you, this time round, spent more time just doing those 3 stations and kind of put to one side the technical side? Because you can still score points for, having DHSs in your scoring, or how did you kind of change your approach, if at all?
Yes, I think... well, having said that, then the face-to-face is difficult. You can revise for the technical aspects, the technical skill station. Most people would do that by doing an AO course, AO basics, and then they'd use the revision material from that. So, they're essentially being examined on things that are pretty straightforward orthopedic basic skills that you're going to be doing. So there's nothing too fancy, and therefore the revision isn't probably that tricky. And the revision isn't really stuff you can do sat at home necessarily, other than flicking through the AO books. And the same with a comm station that would normally be there. Again, you can practice with mates or whatever, or colleagues, but yeah, it's a bit more tricky to revise for. So probably even, I would say even in the original, I'd probably focus more on those 3, the portfolio with the list planning with the presentation, and then also the clinical, which I think probably takes everyone's focus the most, the clinical, although it's very important to bear in mind that they all, well, we don't know for the face-to-face, but I certainly assume, looking at the way it's all publicly available stuff anyway, but so the marks was out of 182 for the virtual interview, as per the interview guideline book that they sent around. And there was 3 stations, and the shortlisting was 32 out of 32. So my assumption was that it was 32 for the shortlisting and then 50 per station, out of 50 per station. Yeah. Although there may have been a different weighting there, but that wasn't published. So.
Sure. And I guess because there's a lot of people applying, and I'm sure there are a lot of people with tied scores, people have asked, are there some stations that are more important than others? So if you're tied on your interview score, on the applicant handbook, it says that the clinical station ranks quite highly amongst them. But did that kind of sway your revision at all, or?
To be honest, no. It didn't from that perspective, but it did just purely from an interest perspective. I think I find it much more interesting to read about the clinical stuff, because I know it's what I'm going to be doing day to day than I do, some of the other stuff. So I think that was always my focus was on the clinical side more than anything, but not for any particular reason other than interest.
Okay. And in terms of the portfolio station, I mean, I've had people asking me, how does it work in the virtual format? Does face-to-face format, you bring your portfolio, you give it to the examiners, and it's easy. What about the virtual format?
Yeah, so the difference is essentially you can't look at your portfolio, right? So your portfolio becomes the self-assessment stuff that you've submitted. So that's been verified and you've uploaded evidence, and someone said that what you've said is justified, and they're giving you the marks for it. Whereas there's more flexibility in the face-to-face to be able to ask you questions about your portfolio and various things. So obviously they can ask you anything they like, about your portfolio, what you've done, things you've achieved, what you're most proud of, those kind of generic interview questions that you'd expect to get. But they can't obviously have a look through your portfolio to be able to do that. So,
sure.
but they will. I don't know for sure, I suppose, but I'm sure they would have had access to your self-assessment material beforehand. So perhaps that plays a part. I don't know, but.
So I guess kind of all those other things that you don't score points for, where in the face-to-face format, they could pick some of those things out and talk to you about, they wouldn't really be able to do that in the virtual format.
Yeah, exactly. But it still really comes down, I guess, to knowing your portfolio well enough to be able to speak about, having all those things on the tip of your tongue that you would for any kind of interview, job interview or whatever, is like, the standard things. What are you most proud of? What's a weakness? What's a strength? All that kind of stuff. So you should have all those answers really on the tip of your tongue. So part of the prep, I think, from that perspective, is about making make a table about, with all these kind of things, and having sort of 1 or 2 examples of each that you can just come off a bullet point off the tip of your tongue and then talk about that. So.
Yeah. And in terms of, so going to the face-to-face interview, there's documents you have to show on the day itself. How did that work in the virtual format?
So, I mean, very similar. So in the face-to-face, you do it before anything starts. So in a, before the OSCE stations even started, that's all out of the way and done. And on the virtual format, it's the same. So you'd meet, the admin person would meet you beforehand on the chat and go through verification of ID and stuff, and then you'd move on to the interview after that. So it's all kind of taken out of the way in the first instance. So.
Fine. And I guess throughout the whole interview process, both in the face-to-face and the virtual, what is your kind of most useful piece of advice that you give anyone for the entire process? Is there one thing that stuck out for you that you thought really made a difference?
So, I mean, obviously there's loads of advice that you can give in terms of the interview and performance and stuff, but at the end of the day, you have to be in the mindset that the people that are sat opposite you, opposite you on the table, are looking at you and judging you as a day one reg. So they want someone to be safe. They want someone who's clearly shown they've done their reading, they know their stuff, but they're not going to make crazy unsafe decisions about patients. So it's very valid an argument to say at this point I'd escalate, and this is a decision that would be above my level, my grade to be taking. And of course you may get pushed. Your consultant may not be available, or you can't get hold of anyone, or you need to make a decision now type thing. But you need to stay safe. So just behave as you would day one in your new job. So
yeah. And always a kind of controversial topic is courses, interview courses. Are they useful? Are they not? Should you go on them?
Gut feeling, waste of time, waste of money.
Yeah.
But clearly some people will feel like they'd like a bit more support and help and practice than others. And obviously there's lots of opportunities out there to spend money if you'd like to spend money, but I didn't use one either time. So that's, yeah.
Because they range from being potentially free if you're a local trainee up to hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands of pounds. So,
I mean, wow. So we're very lucky in the West Midlands to have some real good, or have had and continue to have some really good core surgical training, particularly where I am now in the West Midlands. And, in terms of interview prep and practice and stuff. So I suppose if you're in an area where you're not really getting that, then, maybe it's useful to think about subscribing and paying to go on a course or whatever. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a lot of money. And yeah, I suppose if you're flush with cash and you've got loads of money to spend and you're just happy to spend it, then that's fine. The one thing I will say that actually, having said that, having slated courses entirely, is I did go on. Actually, I remember I did go on one now. I went to the Oswestry interview prep course the year before I applied, so that would have been my CT1 year. And actually, it was really good, in fairness. So although I spent the whole time slating it, it was actually, I can definitely recommend a course that gives you a brief, concise overview of the topics that you'd be expected to talk about, and just gives you an idea of what the stations are like, etc., etc. Okay. So actually, yeah, in fairness, having slated it, maybe it's worth considering, but just don't spend too much money.
That was done at a kind of an earlier stage, though, when you didn't need to prepare for it.
Yeah, I suppose. It was just to get a framework of where I was at, really. So, because you can do that. I mean, if you're prepping for the clinical station, you'll have a vague idea already, I would hope, at the start about the kind of things you might get asked about, and it's going to be, there may be a open fracture that you have to deal with, and then that'll be the sort of the thing to chat through, or there may be something a bit more weird and wonderful, but realistically it's going to be something that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? So you kind of have in your mind about the kind of different aspects, and that's maybe what a course would do, is give you that framework if you don't have it already. But I don't think you need to go on a course. So.
Right. And I guess, are there any mistakes you think you made, or things that you wish you would have done better in the whole process, either before the interview or even during the interview?
Things I would have done, wish I'd done better. Yeah. So the difficulty in doing a virtual interview, I find, is that, well, in fact, let's be honest, it's difficulty in any medical interview. It's outside of orthopaedics, it can be any specialty that you apply to. It's always a bit difficult to know when to stop talking and how much to give at each point. And it's treading that fine line in my mind between giving the interviewer what they want to hear, but also not rattling on for 10 minutes so they then can't ask you the next questions, but also showing that you have enough knowledge that maybe they want to then prompt you to ask you the next. So, you know what the next question is going to be, and you getting up to the point where they're going to ask you that, but you're not, answering the whole thing for them without giving them an opportunity to answer the question. So I find that a delicate balance, and I actually find it more tricky to do on the virtual one, as I said, than face to face, really, because you don't get that body language, the feedback about where you're at and how things are going. So.
And did they encourage you, the examiners, both face-to-face and virtual format, when you were saying things, or did they just keep stone wall?
Mixed bag, actually. So having chatted to other friends, I think it very much depended on the interview panel as to how much, how much you would give before you were asked the next question. But then I suppose part of that is also the, your own personal interpretation of how things are going. And if you feel like things are going well, then maybe you feel like it's going all right. But if you feel like it's going badly stage by stage, then clearly it's going to feel worse. And probably that's worth pointing out as well, actually, is that in the face-to-face, you've got 5 separate OSCE stations where you're meeting 5 separate panels of people, whereas in the virtual one, they're all on the same call. So all of your examiners are on the same call. And I'm sure there are things put in place to make sure that that's objective and, doesn't disadvantage you if you do badly on one particular station. But clearly that's, it's easier in face-to-face OSCE if you spend, 15 minutes in a station and then you come out and you think, well, that went really badly. But then you move to the next, sit outside the next room, and then actually you have a bit of time to think, oh, I'll forget about that and move on to the next. Whereas when you're doing an interview where everyone's on the same call, it's a bit harder.
So the people who are on your station for the portfolio station were speaking to you examiner-wise, and then the other examiners for the other stations were muted, but they run the virtual format. And then the next station came and those people unmuted themselves while everyone else stayed quiet. So you've got quite a big audience, I guess, that you're giving your answers to.
It's still the same as it would be in a panel, isn't it? But this time it's the same panel for the set for all, if you like, for all 4 or 3 stations.
Fine. So I guess they have to be objective, of course, and they must have some way of ignoring your previous station, moving on to the next station once you finish that. And I guess it's quite disconcerting you thinking, oh, they probably heard me say the answer to that previous question on the previous station, and they may be judging you for that.
Exactly, that's the worry, isn't it? Is that if one goes really badly, but I suppose you just have to try and again focus on the fact that it doesn't matter. It's gone now. You can't change the what you've done so far, so you have to just focus on what's next to make sure that you pick up points there.
And I guess the final thing I want to ask you is, so we've talked a lot about the interview, but I guess the run up to the interview, it's striking that balance between maximizing your time in theatre and getting theatre experience, making sure patients are cared for on the ward, doing your exam preparation or your interview preparation, plus or minus exam preparation for MRCS, if you need to do that as well, maximizing your CV as well. So how did you know how much to do at what stage? And did you completely sort of, try and stay out of theatre when you were coming up to your ST3 interview and just purely focus on, go home early if you can and revise? Or how did you sort of play that?
I didn't actually. I take the view, which I think has been repeated quite a few times really by sort of seniors that I've met over the years, is at the end of the day, well, I mean, fine, you need to focus a bit on the exam, and revising for the interview. And revising for the interview is going to be slightly different to being a work day to day, just because of the nature of the fact that you're revising for a panel interview versus what you do on the job day to day. But realistically, like I said, every scenario that you meet in the interview will be something that could easily be seen at work day to day. So, I don't necessarily see them as 2 separate things. So from my view, I don't think you should be sacrificing your clinical experience for, an interview format, other than making sure that you're happy to deliver it in the way that's asked. Does that make sense? So, you may have to practice with your friends to deliver a 10-minute or 15-minute interview scenario around a clinical case, but equally you may well see that case at work, and then you kind of reading around the BOSE guidelines while you're doing it, and you're just checking out this, that, and the other, and making sure that you know what's going on. Same with the practical stuff. I don't know how, none of us know how things are going to go going forward, but you need to know how a DHS triple reamer is put together, and you need to know, how to do a lag screw and how to, when to measure, when to countersink, all this kind of things. That's stuff that you do day to day. So you should be getting hopefully that experience in theatre. Hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% sort of echo that as well. I completely agree with that. I think that's pretty much it, really, because I don't want to. I'm conscious I don't want to go into the specific interview station and talk about that because I don't want to spoil the surprise for next time. But is there any other comments you'd give or advice you'd give people who are in their CT2 or equivalent, coming up to the interview to try and maximise?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I suppose is that it's not something you can revise for on your own. I don't think you need to find a group of people who you can revise with, or a colleague, a friend who's going through it. And if you can't do that in your local hospital because you're the only CT2, then hopefully your deanery teaching means that you can meet other people that are applying to orthopaedics, and you can meet them and practice that way. Because let's be honest, again, like in any other interview, you can sit and read a book, but until you're delivering it face to face in a scenario format under a time pressure, you're never really going to be able to get the answers that you want to get out in time. So you need to practice in the format that I think is going to be there. it feels a bit funny for me to say, I suppose, given that I was, well, I don't know how to put it, really shafted is the right word, maybe, by the shortlisting score last year, and you know, having done well the year before. But I don't think you should focus on the shortlisting score too much. You know, in the virtual interview, it was 32 points out of 150 plus 32. In the normal one, when they published it back in 2019, it's like out of 300 and something. I wrote it down. You know, so it actually doesn't really. What did I write it down? Yeah, it doesn't actually really count for a great deal in the grand scheme of things, other than if they use it for shortlisting, which is probably the main barrier to get over. So you have to hit the minimum points, but after that, really it essentially is wiped out by your performance on the day in your clinical and your portfolio and your prioritization stations. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, giving equal weighting to each station and making sure you spend time on that prioritization on even the portfolio station, which should be an easy station. I find people just think, oh, I know my portfolio, I know about myself, put that to one side. But actually, you do so many marks about something that, you know, you should know about yourself.
Yeah. And like you say, it's the worth the same. So, you know, at the end of the day, if you don't have those answers on the tip of your tongue when they ask you about, you know, what you think is your greatest weakness, or, you know, a time at work when whatever you've had to deal with a difficult interaction or something, you know, you have to have these examples just to be able on the tip of your tongue. Because if you don't, then you're just going to sit there and be like, oh, I don't know, and can you come back to that in a minute and ask me another question, and then, you know, the whole thing just falls apart. So it doesn't matter how well you know your most guidelines for the management of fracture clinics or whatever, you know. So yeah.
Absolutely. Listen, Adam, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you. Thank you so much for giving up your time. I'm sure a lot of people are going to appreciate that as well. I would say that, you know, next time we're going to be looking, you know, at a different ST3 to get their perspective on the specific interview stations themselves, and going a bit more, you know, deep dive into each station and how to kind of maximize your score or get the most out of it. But I think in terms of an overview of how you approach the year, how the interview itself was, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
No worries, mate.